merry 12 days of Christmas season. After last week's break for Christmas Eve, we now return with our first New Year's Eve special. Which top 10 Fantastical Truth episodes and Lorehaven.com articles did readers love most in the last year? We will survey all of these and give some fun updates about the topics to close our 2024 podcast season.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Happy New Year and welcome to the season finale of Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm E. Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven, and my New Year's resolution for the last several years has been getting a novel published, and this year it finally happens. Above the Circle of Earth, my debut sci-fi novel, launches in March 2025 from Enclave Publishing.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and currently kicking myself that I haven't written an article yet about all these drone swarms everyone's talking about, because that is fantastic clickbait right now. But we're going to talk in this episode 243 about the favorite Lorehaven articles and podcast episodes that do exist from 2024.
I'm glad that the numbers alone tell this story because, Zach, I love each and every one of these podcast episodes. I love each and every one of the articles and reviews that we've done, including the on-screen features that really picked up this year, timely short takes from a Christian perspective of the current movies and streaming shows that people are talking about. I love our articles about the Christian fantastical realm. And I love all of the dozens of reviews of the best Christian-made fantastical novels that we can find. We try to post new reviews every Friday. That'll look a little bit different going into 2025. Stay tuned to this podcast in the month of January for details about that. But as of this episode, I do know we've had several new on-screen articles from Parker. A little too new to make this list. Parker J. Cole has been one of our top on-screen contributors in 2024. All shout-outs to her. We also have a new article from Jeneth Dick, who does graphic design for Lorehaven and many other book covers. You will learn more about that in 2025. Also, lots of prophecies here. You get the good news first. But Jeneth has been one of our biggest chosen fans that we know of, but she's also keeping track of the Christian creativity renaissance that took several steps forward in the year 2024 and will continue to give us more great stories, or certainly stories to talk about, going into 2025. If you want to learn about those articles and resources early, not just on this podcast, subscribe free to get those updates as they release. You will then also be able to join the Lorehaven Guild, our Castle in the Cloud and Discord. I'll say more about that later on in this episode. First, however, our top sponsor, in fact, our top sponsor all year, has been Oasis Family Media. We're extremely grateful for their support of Lorehaven and this podcast. They're the owners of Enclave Publishing. It is my publisher, but their sponsorship predates that. And just last month in December, they released the conclusion to the Nightingale trilogy by J.J. Fisher, Memoria. Would you save a life if you knew it would destroy another? In the deeply divided world of Caldera, nothing is as it seems. Taken captive by a faceless enemy, Stephanie Winter fights to reclaim her soul as her gift spirals out of control, and the deadly poison coursing through her veins begins to exact its terrible vengeance. Dorian and Cass are forced into an uneasy alliance in order to find the woman they both love, a woman who has all but vanished from the face of the earth along with the reliquary. Finding her becomes impossible as the identity of their greatest adversary continues to elude them. When Caldera's past catches up with the trio's future, Stephanie, Dorian, and Cass are forced to make decisions that threaten everything and everyone they care about. Each of them is offered a chance to sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of the other, but will they take it, and what will it cost them in the end? Enclave Publishing presents Memoria, Book 3 in the Nightingale Trilogy by J.J. Fisher. It is available now wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or order it online at Amazon or from enclavepublishingstore.com. It's also available in audio from Oasis Audio. You can see that cover and learn more about this book and all our other podcast sponsors for this episode at lorehaven.com/podcast. Zach, for our top 10 this year, I thought we'd alternate between the most popular episodes of this podcast, Fantastical Truth, as well as our other articles at Lorehaven. We're not including the reviews here. It's just the articles, because I think that's one of the most underrated features of Lorehaven is these articles now going back many, many years, and even more if you count the original Speculative Faith blog. More about that next month. Someone who started out on the Speculative Faith blog even before she got her own fantasy trilogy published was author R.J. Anderson, a Christian author of fantasy. And her article is called The Christian Roots of Fantasy. It was actually published in the print issue of the Lorehaven magazine when we were doing a print issue. It was the fall 2018 issue, the one with Morgan L. Bussey looking real spooky on the cover. This is a fantastic article, a great little summary of the genre once known as fairy stories, which sprang from biblical ground. And it starts with a conversation that R.J. Anderson had at a women's Bible conference where she had just sold her last book. She says, "I was heading to the auditorium for my keynote talk when a nervous-looking young woman plucked my sleeve. 'Excuse me,' she stammered. 'Could I ask you why you write books?' Her voice dropped to a whisper. 'Like that?' 'You mean fantasy?' I asked, smiling at her. She nodded, eyes wide with anxiety and fear. I didn't have much time to spare, but my heart went out to her. It wasn't hard to guess what she believed, that fantasy stories glorify witchcraft, paganism, and the occult, and no serious Christian should have anything to do with them, especially not one of the main speakers at a Bible conference. Yet I didn't feel defensive, because I didn't need to. Instead, I was happy to tell the young woman why I love fantasy, because this genre offers an opportunity to illustrate biblical truths in a fresh way and speak to people who might never have listened otherwise. Coming in at position number 10, going in descending order, is this article, The Christian Roots of Fantasy by R.J. Anderson. Zach, you read this one recently. Any thoughts about this article? Really basic, but a really great overview about the biblical roots for the fantasy that oppose the legalistic traditions some Christians have inherited, arguing from Scripture, not just from, hey, those Christians are bad, so therefore fantasy good.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who say these kinds of objections, as R.J. Anderson recounted, it's a little sheepish. It's a little like, I don't know about this. They're not trying to be judgmental. They're just, as we said in our last episode about the Lewis and Tolkien onlyism phenomenon, episode 242, a lot of this comes from a well-meaning place of wanting to watch your life and doctrine closely, because especially a lot of parents, you see these kind of crazy books at bookstores and libraries that are front and center, covered in the pride flag and other kind of symbols that is going to lead you or others astray. It's just natural to kind of lump all these things together. And so I'm going to suggest an antidote to this, which is go read Lewis and Tolkien and then go read what either directly inspired them or directly followed them, and then read some new stuff that's in that same tradition. But I think, for a lot of people, they just haven't been fantasy or sci-fi readers ever. And I think sometimes in our little community of Christians who love fantasy and sci-fi, we forget that a lot of normies are out there that just don't ever read these books. They didn't read Dragonlance in 6th grade, or The Hobbit in 7th grade, or Wheel of Time in 9th grade. They didn't grow up with this kind of stuff, and they don't know where to start. And the immediate options to them to start that are the front and center, where they see at the bookstore library, it's pretty scary, and for good reason. So I think the best response is, hey, have you read the Chronicles of Narnia? Have you read the Lord of the Rings? Have you read the follow-up books to these? Have you read the Ransom trilogy, that preceded Narnia? Have a conversation about that first. And I think that's just a really easy way to kind of crack open that door to fantasy pilling people. Can we use that phrase, instead of red pilling, sci-fi pilling people? I think that's a good place to start.
It absolutely is, and that's a big part of Lorehaven's mission, to equip Christian fans of these stories, not just to find the best ones, but to understand the purpose for them, the purpose in biblical worldview, not just my feelings. I mean, feelings do matter. God gave us emotions, and it's good to overcorrect from bad evangelical traditions, but move past that. Each one, reach one, and this article by R.J. Anderson is a great way to do that. Hey, a mission for you, faithful listener. Go to the show notes for this episode, 243. It's at lorehaven.com, or it should show up in your podcast player. See the links for every single one of these top 10 resources, including the podcast and the articles. Find the one that is best going to serve a friend or family member and then email them that link or send that to them over text or social media or something. If you like, tag Lorehaven so that we know you sent it and can join the conversation or answer questions. Or just go ahead and do it however you'd like. We'd love to help grow the readership for these stories, not just to support the authors, but to support the readers, to support the church, to equip the church to enjoy these stories, especially if they're already doing it for the best and most biblical reasons that we know. Writers' conferences are also a great way to do that on the creative side, which leads me to our 5th most popular podcast episode, coming in at position 9. That was called What Can First-Time Guests Expect at a Christian Writers Conference with J.J. Johnson. This was a really fun episode to do, and it had this summary. We're partners with Realm Makers as the leading fantastical conference for Christian creatives. Recently, organizers shared that over 40% of registrations for this July's event are first-time guests. This brings back memories, so we thought we'd share them with you. What's it like at a writers' conference? And what should first-time guests expect at Realm Makers and beyond? I've wanted to do an episode like this for quite some time, and I wanted to make it evergreen, not just before the 2024 Realm Makers Conference, which apparently was the last event at the hotel where we've enjoyed a lot of annual conferences in St. Louis. Since then, Realm Makers announced they're also adding an expo. So this July in 2025, the conference is moving to Grand Rapids in Michigan at a different venue in order to host a more fan-focused event alongside the Writers' Conference. There's going to be more information about that, certainly on this show going forward into the new year, and also at realmmakers.com. And I think a lot of fans, though, Zach, not just the creative types, but a lot of fans love these behind-the-scenes episodes about how books are made. And if they've never been to a Writers' Conference, knowing just exactly where all this stuff is coming from, that helps to build trust. That helps people know that there are professional groups cultivating these resources for Christians and helping to give a platform to these faithful Christian creators. We are not a writers' conference here, but whenever we talk about something related to the making of these books, we always like to make it more like the behind-the-scenes features on a DVD of a movie you love. Weta Workshop is not trying to hire everybody who watches the behind-the-scenes on the Lord of the Rings disc releases, but it's really fun to know how they do it. And as a homeschool graduate, I remember loving those books that take you into the factory or, into the professional organization to explain how it's made. And yet, of course, I think maybe a higher percentage of fans of fantastical fiction like to create their own stories. They may not be trying to publish a book someday, but they're writing fan fiction or some other kind of story just for their own enjoyment and hopefully for the glory of God. And so I think an episode like this can help people cultivate their own skill in making these stories on their own.
I've taken both my teenage daughters now to Realm Makers when they were each about 14, 15. They've come away with different experiences from it. My oldest daughter, when we went there, 4 years ago now, 3 years ago, her favorite aspect was the costume contest. And we went as Wreck-It Ralph and Vanellope. And she made this incredible 3D costume for me to wear, and just
and
really
y'all were
detailed.
Finalists too.
Yeah, we were second place in the contest, and that was her first time to ever do a cosplay type thing. She's really fallen in love with musical theater since then, and costuming and makeup and creating characters and in person, really live performance. She's kind of gotten away from writing, but that's fine because she still loves creativity in these other ways. And she's a huge reader. And so for her, it was really fun like you said, to kind of see behind the scenes, meet some of these authors, get to know just this wider Christian creative community and see that there's quite a bit of that out there. And that's really given her a passion now for Christian art. And again, more in the form of musical theater. With my middle daughter, she is actually trying to write a book now that she got a lot of training in at the teen track this last year that was taught by author Kara Swanson, who's been a guest on the show. And Kara really walked these teenagers through the whole process of, brainstorming ideas, outlining, drafting, revising, publishing, marketing, everything a young author would want to know. And it's pretty incredible, Stephen, that there are teenagers that are publishing books now because you can do that, like, especially in the age of indie publishing. And so my daughter has been hard at work on that. She's was working on that during November, during the national month where people write novels whose name that we're not going to repeat because
I noticed a little evasion there. Yeah, we have National Month where people write novels at home.
Right. And she's fallen even more in love with fantasy. She just finished Brandon Sanderson's kind of pinnacle book, Mistborn, and she wants to start Way of Kings, but she's like, I got to get through finals and a bit before I start on that giant doorstop of a book. But she's going to be coming with me to the expo next year. We've already booked our tickets. It's going to be right on the tails of another ministry conference I have to go to. I can't wait to go there. I just love being in this community. I love being around other authors. It's just it's so inspiring. It's really just fun time of catching up with people that I completely resonate with. And there's this whole hashtag thing like overheard at Realm Makers, just the funniest things that when you repeat them out of context, it just makes everyone laugh.
Well, this 2025 Realm Makers will be the first one that I get to attend as a published sci-fi author myself. So the fact that they're doing an expo more fan focused is absolutely fantastic timing. I can't wait. I'm really looking forward to it. And stay tuned at lorehaven.com for more news about that as soon as we know it. Going back over to the article side, coming in at position number 8 is actually an older piece from Josiah DeGraff from 2021, but still very timely because of the now 2-part Dune film series and the culture surrounding it. That's my best pigeon Arakan there. It accompanies every single Instagram video related to Dune in some way. Here's a clip from that article by Josiah. When we're living in a hostile world, we're often tempted to adopt our enemy's methods and do whatever it takes to win. After all, if they're using vicious tactics that bring victory, don't we need to adopt similar strategies to survive? Duke Leto shows the example of a better path. To some extent, I'm unable to explain with words how we should emulate Leto. Situations vary. Stories shouldn't be reduced to specific theses. The best way we can enjoy Dune Part 1 and grow as people is to reflect on Leto's character, hold his example in our mind, and use this as inspiration to act likewise. Josiah actually did a 2-part series, just like Dune Part 2. The second part is called Duke Leto Also Shows How Christians Can Practice Shrewd Wisdom in a Hostile World. You'll see a few of these articles, by the way, coming up in the top 10 that are not 2024 articles. I'm not going to rule out an article that tends to have some staying power and is still evergreen. In fact, I think it's a great compliment to the creator, in this case, Josiah DeGraff, who, by the way, in 2025 is also making a New Year's resolution come true. He's planning to release his fantasy novel, A Study of Shattered Spells. We'll have all these links in the show notes, so you need to follow Josiah's work. He himself is going to be around for quite a bit, and fortunately, he's still sticking around Lorehaven, even though I saw that he's recently moved on from the fantastic creative group Story Embers. So go check out that article about Duke Leto and Dune. Zach, any further thoughts about that?
Man, I love the Dune films. I'm only recently a fan of the book that I read a couple years ago. I've got the sequel, or I guess the trilogy now to follow up on the books. I love the positive view of fatherhood and masculinity through Duke Leto. I love that the film didn't try to deconstruct that or make it weird or something. And the way that Paul takes that up and kind of turns it into his own mission to carry on his father's legacy. Paul is obviously a warrior. There's this whole debate of like, is he the Messiah or is that all fake? How is that being manipulated? But Paul is very much, he doesn't want to just destroy everything. He wants to make something better. It is, a military story, though. It is a global or a intergalactic war story. So you're going to see that. Mostly, I'm just glad that there's rumors that another Dune movie is coming out, and I got these movies recently in 4K, so I can't wait to watch that on an actual 4K screen that I have now. Because there was just nothing quite like seeing these in the theater. I mean, these are the types of movies that we go to the theater for, like that you just can't see that like anywhere else, even on a 4K screen or whatever. But I love just the love for the visual medium that Denis Villeneuve had. That so much of Dune Part 2 particularly was so visual. Like you didn't have to remember what they said. You don't need subtitles on to understand a giant worm just clobbering all these soldiers or just these laser gun fights or explosions, but just the visuals with Paul interacting with the Fremen, just incredible moments. It's just a great sign that great creative works are still being made in the world.
I will say that although Dune Part 2 released earlier this year, 2024, I liked it, but I found that I enjoyed Part 1 more because Duke Leto was in it. He was the big good. He represented the healthy ancestry of virtue and tradition and someone who fights to be a hero despite all the political grossness around him. And so, spoiler alert, he's not really in Part 2 other than as a legacy, and his house is in ruins, and that's part of what Paul Atreides is trying to restore. And of course, Part 2 shows the counterpoint to Duke Leto. Paul has to make some decisions that Duke Leto probably would not have made, and Paul is possessed of certain advantages. So a bit of a warning from the author there of going for these more political strategies and some arguable deceptions for the greater good. Well, that's for fans to debate. So maybe we need to go to Josiah if he has time left and ask him for a follow-up about, hey, what do we think about Paul Atreides? So Josiah, let's talk about that. Visual earnest sci-fi storytelling is terrific, but so is the written word. And I took the Sponsor 2 segment for Above the Circle of Earth, which is my sci-fi debut that launches in March 2025 from Enclave Publishing. There's going to be a hardcover, a digital ebook version, as well as an audio book for this sci-fi debut. I've mentioned the plot before, and you can learn more about that. Read the back cover at estephenburnett.com. Definitely sign up for updates there. We're going to have even more of those going forward into the final 2-month stretch before the release this March. But I thought I'd read just a few endorsements from some fantastic storytellers. And that's one of the perks of writing a new novel is you got friends and supporters who will just emerge. Sometimes you expect them to, and then sometimes folks just come out of nowhere, and then they're reading your book, and then they're enjoying it, and hopefully we'll have a great launch for Above the Circle of Earth. This from Lindsay Llewellyn, author of The Chaos Grid. Burnett wowed me with his unput-downable sci-fi debut from heart-pounding scenes on Mars, inspiration for Arrakis, by the way, to one family's defiance against an all-too-plausible Earthen regime. Above the Circle of Earth lands every punch it sets up. Get your highlighter ready for spiritual themes flying off the page at light speed. This fast-paced plot with bold characters risking everything to follow the truth will suck you in chapter after chapter. Fans of Star Trek, The Bourne Identity, and The Book of Acts, pick up this novel. James R. Hannibal also came in hot from the skies with Above the Circle of Earth serves thrilling sci-fi adventure packed with based theology. I can't wait to see where that incredible ship takes Brock and his crew next. He's the award-winning author of Lion Warrior and the quest leader for the Light Raiders discipleship learning adventure. This from Carrie Neitz, the award-winning author of Lost Bits and Amish Vampires in Space, says, E. Stephen Burnett takes what could be a challenging premise and fits it for the stars. With stellar world-building, accessible prose, and well-drawn characters, his story is equal parts action and introspection. That'll make a fella's new year. I really hope this story does well and clears a path for more fantastic Christian science fiction of this variety. We love YA fantasy and romantasy and cozy fantasy and all that stuff. We're probably going to be talking about in February, by the way, spoiler alert. But we'd love to see these kinds of stories grow. And Above the Circle of Earth is designed in part to help make that happen. So sign up for updates at estephenburnett.com and join the space mission. Help support those needy space missionaries for the 22nd century. Coming in now at position number 7, we're back on the podcast side with an episode that we did kind of on a whim, if I remember right, Zach. There was no guest or not really any particular inciting incident for this one. Should we get mad when Christians scorn fantastical fiction? That was just you and me having a jaw in the studio, and this was the description. If you're a Christian fantastical fan, you're going to have a bad time. That's because some critics accuse you of special sin by liking that entertainment stuff. So when that popular religious leader or that random comment, or even your own trusted family member or pastor warns you against popular culture and fantastical stories, how should you respond in wisdom? I'm, I guess, not surprised that a lot of listeners resonated with this because although, Zach, you're in a good church, I'm in a good church, there's fantastical fans in that church, but it's not just a church made up of fantastical fans, so we're kind of sheltered from this stuff. I know for a fact that a lot of our listeners are still haunted by the memories or maybe the present reality of people who are very skeptical about their fantastical enjoyment. So putting all of those tips into an episode like this seems to have really resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think sometimes people come across this in more subtle ways. You know, it's kind of like you're reading that, like why are you doing that? Or it's more like, hey, what's on your shelf? And then when people ask that, they expect it to be nonfiction, and then you tell them it's fiction,
theology.
Right?
Yeah,
and then they just kind of give you these kind of eyebrow look, right? And sometimes I think people are just jaded by books they read that they didn't enjoy, or fantasy series that have still not been completed by a living author after 14 years now, that also had a very mixed HBO adaptation, just to name a very vague example. So I think there's a lot of feelings why people have this view, but I think also some people just don't understand sometimes the purpose of fiction, which is what we've gone into, many episodes about in detail. And which I'll just summarize by saying fiction helps us imagine a whole other world and life. It's not meant necessarily to teach. It's not didactic. It's not, propositional theory. It's meant to imagine, right? And now there was one comment that was going viral at this time on Twitter where an apologist, Justin Peters, said, "No work of fiction should ever change our worldview."
Oh, that was the inciting incident. Right. Now I remember.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was kind of in the middle of our episode. We talked around that. And okay, if we're talking about godless and silly myths that lead people into heresy, well, yes, those should not change your view. I mentioned the drones at the beginning of the episode that are so hot right now, and just a million theories about not only drones, but aliens and, ancient peoples and, mole people and ultra terrestrials and all kinds of crazy things. And we like to have fun with some of that stuff. Man, people really do take some of those myths seriously. And I think they've already kind of adopted them. And sometimes, science fiction can be a helpful corrective to say, like, no, this is not really what's happening. We have to remember what fiction is meant to do. It's meant to posit a world where there are certain starting conditions, and then think about what would you do if you were living in this world? And then, how are there parallels between that made up world and the real world? What can we learn from that? It's not always going to be a one-to-one, like Josiah talked about in his article. We can't exactly transpose Arrakis to modern day America. Like, it doesn't really work that way. But we can look at the kind of the timeless virtues in the face of the timeless, vices. And that gives us a roadmap for how to live. It's not meant to be a tract for, perfectly expressing the Christian faith. It's not meant to be a substitute for evangelism or other types of ministry.
Well, speaking of skepticism about stories, that leads to another one of our top articles coming in at position 6. And I actually wrote this one in June 2023, so I was a little surprised, but not quite, to see it on the top 10 list for 2024. Apparently, Zach, in 2024, we just didn't have enough controversies. There was a shortage, possibly because of inflation. So people had to go back to the previous year to get a controversy like this one from the article that I wrote. The Chosen creator Dallas Jenkins responds to on-set pride flag criticism. So cast your imagination back to June 2023, when there was a guy working on The Chosen who was glimpsed in a production video who had that little false religious flag festooning his camera equipment, and everybody lost it. And they said, "Well, what's next? Are we going to make Jesus gay? Are we going to make the disciples gay? Is there going to be a trans follower?" Like some of these more moral panic objections, usually from a lot of people who don't really like The Chosen or biblical fiction or fiction altogether, and they don't really talk about that as openly. They just sort of hide that. But it's not so hidden. It is an open secret that Christians who are making stories sometimes need to hire non-Christians. And that's one of the points that Dallas Jenkins made in a video responding to the controversy. I just went through and I highlighted 20 key points from Dallas Jenkins' response, including this one, quote, "The Chosen is not a church or ministry." Now, this is me paraphrasing what he said, by the way. "Yes, the show has ministerial goals. Some are calling the production a Christian production, but what does this mean? They don't have group prayers or a faith statement. They're a business that makes Christian content. Believers can disagree about this approach, but they must remember The Chosen is a for-profit company. Just like Solomon built the temple using help from pagans or non-believers, even people who print Bibles may not be Christians." End quote. That's my paraphrase of what Dallas Jenkins said. And arguably The Chosen fetches headlines, and many Christians are very happy to love it, and others are very happy to hate it. And I consider biblical fiction a cousin genre to fantastical fiction, and it is arguably The Chosen, the top example of Christians making stories that appeal to Christians and to many non-Christians alike. I mean, there's many Mormons who like The Chosen, and previously they were even working with an arguably Mormon-owned company, Angel Studios. The Chosen is its own thing now. They respect that company, but they're no longer working with them. And yet, that means they do have to hire non-believers, you guys. Like, I'm sorry, even churches have to hire non-believers. Hopefully they're not putting them behind the pulpit, but they might be paving the parking lot or operating the crane that lifts the steeple into place. We ought to be a little wiser with what we expect of a Christian-run for-profit business versus what we expect from a church. Not every position is the pastor, you guys. And in this case, it was a cameraman who was an independent contractor. It was his own equipment he was bringing in, and he has the right to put little stickers on there, or he has the right to have his own beliefs in the world. Now, we wouldn't let him join the church. We wouldn't let him write the script, but The Chosen doesn't let folks like that write the script. And there's many rumors that say otherwise. And it's just one of the risks, Zach, of believers trying to make storytelling, that they're going to get this kind of criticism, often from people who wouldn't have a clue how to make a better story, even if they wanted to, which they generally don't.
This takes me back to our interview with Phil Lawler, and he talked about the various voice actors they've had on Adventures in Odyssey from Focus on the Family. Very conservative, trusted ministry. And yet many of the actors they hired, I don't know many, but at least one that he told us about was not a believer.
There's a few of them. Absolutely. Yeah. There's several. That's the reality of that kind of job.
Right. And so, in this business of creating media, books, movies, music, can you make these kinds of things entirely by Christians, entirely by a nonprofit ministry? Well, there are some ministries that do this. There are some churches who make movies or music. So, okay. If that's the case, though, that's what critics want, then I just want to put out a challenge to support these kinds of things. Make these things more successful. Go work for one of these churches or ministries or studios or music labels. Send your kids into college for majors in the arts. Put your money where your mouth is, basically, is what I'm saying to kind of the critics of The Chosen. If we want more Christian-only made arts, that's fine. If people want to do that, well, then go help make it, is all I'm saying. And this isn't meant to be a gotcha. It's meant to say, let's have more of it. Let's have more Christian art. But at the same time, I think we need to have more charity with for-profit businesses that are making Christian art. Now, I think what some of this comes from is the jadedness that many of us have felt about Christian music. That, now that Christian music labels have been around a few decades, there's been enough Christian artists that have wandered away from the faith and also have told us, Christian artists that have told us about the behind-the-scenes shenanigans of so-called Christian labels, where there is a lot of business practice and other behaviors that are anything but Christian. And so it's honestly confused a lot of people. Like, wait a minute, why am I hearing all this stuff, this sinful behavior from a Christian music label? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And part of it is, look, there are a lot of Christians that fall, but a lot of it too is that not everyone who works at a Christian business is a Christian. Because if you're a business, you're going to hire people from all walks of life. Unless you're a church, you're going to be hiring people that maybe don't always agree with what you're doing on a theological level. So, look, I just think the solution to this is more, not less, of Christian creativity.
Well, back in early November, we actually had a podcast episode 237 about The Chosen, guested with one of the writers of The Chosen, Ryan Swanson, who also helped write the best Christmas pageant ever adaptation from Chosen showrunner Dallas Jenkins. So we're going to continue to cover this, and we'll be able to touch on some of these controversies as well. For example, as we record, some of the same Chosen types of critics, or same types of critics of The Chosen, they're upset because there was a clip released where Jesus is speaking with Judas, and their characterization of Jesus says to Judas, "Where's your heart, Judas? Like, I had it before." And people are saying, is this implying that Judas was saved and now has lost his salvation? Well, I don't believe that Christians can lose their salvation. I believe in eternal security, in more properly preservation of the saints or perseverance of the saints. However, there are some earnest Christians who believe otherwise. So you could still be an Orthodox Christian and believe that Judas lost his salvation. I don't like it. I don't even like how it feels saying it, but it is a belief that sincere Christians can hold, respecting some various verses of scripture that seem to imply that. However, I don't think that's necessarily true of that phrase. Like, is "I had your heart" a reference to salvation, or just Judas's clear devotion at the time that now he is about to fall away? Are we not reading into that the "ask Jesus into your heart" language, which is not from the Bible, but is from evangelical tradition, and then just making that association and saying, well, the show is saying that Judas was saved and now he's not? We don't know. We haven't seen the full episode or the full season. So let's wait, actually watch the show beyond clips, and then debate it. It's not for everybody, wrestle with it. Some of the characterizations that they have are certainly subject to interpretation and challenge, and that is okay. That's part of storytelling. Unlike the sermon, it's a rule. It's a rule of biblical fiction. It's a rule of any kind of fiction that you're supposed to engage with it as an illustration, not the main point as if it's a sermon. It's not a sermon. Well, over at position number 5, we have another company that apparently has been drifting into certain kinds of sermons instead of entertainment, and that's Disney. And we had a podcast episode, "How Should Christians Fight to Love a Declining Disney?" with Josh Shepard. "'Tis the season for love and enchanted princesses and handsome princes and such like." This episode released in February. But lately, former fans of these ideas just aren't feeling it, especially from the Disney side of our magical fandoms. When the big mouse keeps getting into big trouble, how's a Christian fan to respond? Josh Shepard brings a balanced biblical perspective into the studio. And Zach, I think he did bring a great perspective there, especially because you and I are much more skeptical. Like, Josh probably still subscribes to Disney Plus. He blogs about it a lot. He's a Christian entertainment journalist, and he writes about a lot of stuff like that. And he's a Disney fan. As he says in the episode, he married into a Disney family, a Disney American family. And so he inherits that and enjoys it. And I find his perspective, though, very necessary and refreshing, coupled with, not contrasted with, a more skeptical approach, noticing how a lot of the Disney storytellers are moving into propaganda, or they're long since moved in. It's not, they don't just lease the propaganda, they buy it and then try to sell it to you. and then their movies flop, and then for some reason they just keep making the same kinds of movies because they can't help themselves. Well, since this article, we had a Disney Pixar release, Inside Out 2, that restored some fans' faith in Pixar. I still want to see it. People loved it and then pumped up the numbers past $1 billion for this film, which means it made a very healthy profit because apparently it did a decent job and it wasn't woke. It wasn't buying into or selling all of these identity obsessions or sexualityism obsessions. It was just normal. It was very traditional. And then also this summer we had the Disney Marvel film Deadpool and Wolverine. That's not my fandom, but it did slash and stab through a lot of skepticism about Marvel just because they were roasting about everybody, including themselves. And I didn't hear anything about the woke stuff in there, just a lot of brutal violence and flippancy and F-bombs. So that's not my thing, but it's a lot of people's things, if for no other reason than it's not woke. But now, Zach, fans are still very anti-Disney, and their next flop is going to be Snow White, releasing in the spring. The trailer literally made me choke on myself. I don't often do that when I'm watching a trailer, but right about the time Snow White is like, yeah, we're going to lead a revolution and take back the kingdom, I made a noise like this. And it was just, it gives me the shivers just to think about it. It's just so trite and so tropey and so not even trendy. They thought it was going to be trendy, but it's not. Fans are downvoting it. It's going to flop. It's not going to earn back all of the money that they spent on the many, many reshoots. And then there's the live action Mufasa movie. I think it will be out by the time this episode releases. I don't know how well that will do, but I don't think it's woke or anything, but a lot of fans are probably just going to get annoyed with it because it's yet another live action remake and it's Disney and they don't like Disney. And then supposedly Disney now is going to make a live action version of Tangled. And I say no.
Man.
I say no.
Please no.
Why are you disrespecting animation like this? There are hardworking artists who worked on these things and not like it has to be animation, but that's how it was born. That's how it should say, stop disrespecting real animation by serious, earnest creators.
Man, this discussion we had with Josh Shepard, it's funny because I feel like I'm on the other side of the discussion of like, should you even read fantasy? Like we talked about earlier in R.J. Anderson's article and the people she talked to and people that scorn us for liking sci-fi and fantasy. It's not that I scorn Josh for loving Disney and still believing the best and looking for the best, but I just had a harder time going there. Again, I've been let down by so many Disney Star Wars films and shows. Not all of them. I loved Rogue One. I loved The Mandalorian. I loved Andor. Didn't like a bunch of the other ones. I'm very worried that Rian Johnson might get a presidential pardon for ruining Star Wars. I think he should go to jail for that. Not that that's really going to happen.
Because he'd be in jail.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But, I do appreciate Josh's optimism about Disney. Part of this was just practical for us. Like we had to cancel something to save money, because all the streaming services are going up. Stephen, I just came across this hilarious tweet the other day where this guy, Chris Backey says, I'm so glad that I made the right financial decision in 2018 and ditched my $89 cable package so that I can now pay $83 a month for YouTube TV, $23 for Netflix, $16 for Disney, $13 for Paramount, $15 for Prime, $10 for Apple, and $21 for HBO.
You only pay for like 1/3 of those things, and certainly not the YouTube TV. I saw that they were recently raising their prices. Isn't that just a cable alternative, though?
Right, and
all these always-on channels,
and it's literally doubled since it was started 5 years ago. There was a hilarious community note on YouTube TV's announcement, and look, we're all kind of feeling the pinch at times, especially when these renew right at Christmas time. I mean, if I could make any suggestion to any marketing executive that's listening now, don't raise your prices around Christmas time, you fools. Do it in July or something when no one cares about, pinching pennies to make every last Christmas gift a winner. Why are you doing it now?
Yeah, they're not the brightest icon on the screen there.
Yeah, but we had to cancel something, and that's what. Not that I have all of these services. I'm only paying for Netflix out of these, I guess. But so I want to believe again, though. I want to be wrong about Disney. And I have seen some rumors that Marvel is getting rid of some of their activist employees that are trying to
supposedly
hijack
they've already
everything.
done it. Yeah, I think Kevin Feige went, hey, this corporate mandate didn't work. Get thee gone. And there have been some cultural shifts that have kind of been reflected in even the November election in the United States that I think really provides a wind at the back of the critics of this sort of thing. So maybe we'll see some corrective measures taken, but it's going to be a while before they actually show up in the theaters or on TV.
Right. It's just going to take time to see what happens.
But why wait on those guys? You can enjoy Christian-made stories, and not just The Chosen, but the kinds of books and everything that we're reviewing at Lorehaven.com, our third sponsor for this episode, with a summons to you, the listener of this podcast. We are bigger than the podcast. Lorehaven.com has been going strong since early 2018, and as we will discuss in our very next episode, the first of 2025, the roots of Lorehaven go back even further. We're now several decades worth of work, leading to amazing articles, and you can get them free all at Lorehaven.com and subscribe free. You can customize what emails you get, whether it's for a new article or new podcast episodes on Tuesdays, or new reviews of the best Christian-made fantastical fiction on Friday. So that's my summons to you. Subscribe free at Lorehaven if you've not already. Lorehaven.com. Look for the box at the bottom. And then also, if you see something there you like, or if one of these articles or podcast episodes, like I mentioned, share that with a friend. Let's grow the readership for this. You don't have to sit around waiting for Disney to turn that battleship slowly around. It's like 4 or 5 years for some of these things. So it's going to take a while to work these silly ideas out of the system. There are more nimble Christian creatives who are doing it now. And we want to get the good stuff and share that with you. So share these articles, these podcast episodes with a friend. See if that helps serve them for the glory of God and for their good as a fantastical fan. Speaking of The Chosen and the woke stuff, coming in at position number 4 as we count down the top 10 here is Jeneth Dick's article, not a 2024 article though, called The Chosen Succeeds Where Woke Stories Fail. That was released in 2023, so about 2 years ago, but again, evergreen content there, aged magnificently. Here's a clip. Woke projects fail, and The Chosen succeeds for a more nuanced reason. Wokeism is not simply the inclusion of diverse or underprivileged characters. In fact, stories that show many ethnic backgrounds, lifestyles, and situations demonstrate a realistic reflection of God's creation. I think Hollywood often fails, however, when they take these realities and force them to be something else. And she goes on to talk about biblical characters who have autism and disabilities, who come from different ethnic backgrounds. But the most important thing that The Chosen does is they do not make Mary Sues or Marty Sues. They do not make girl bosses. They do not make like flawless human characters who basically stay the same and do not learn or change or repent or experience reconciliation throughout the story. They just start out awesome and they end awesome. The only change is that everyone else realizes they're awesome. And so it's just a complete power fantasy, which is dumb for male characters and female characters alike. The Chosen doesn't do it. Great stories don't do it. Propagandistic fake stories do, whether it's from Disney or anybody else. The Chosen, I think, because its creators are working from a biblical worldview, just sort of naturally avoid those landmines. So you may debate its biblical fidelity and whether or not Jesus should have said so-and-so to Judas. But in terms of character development, it's doing very well, and that's why it's winning such an ardent fan base.
So this is such an interesting angle on the show, and it's made me wonder, why are the usual voices celebrating diversity, equity, and inclusion not the biggest fans of The Chosen? Because I usually don't hear these kind of folks talking so positively about The Chosen. I think it's because the E in DEI is missing, the E of equity, which in practical terms means preferential treatment towards certain identity groups.
It's not the same as equality. There's a little slip of the tongue there, an extra syllable been cut out, which makes the definition very slippery and very different.
Yeah, and Jeneth very rightly points out in this article that no one gets a pass because of their identity group or lived experience or whatever kind of background they have. Everyone is called to repentance. No one has secret knowledge of Jesus. In other words, The Chosen is directly rebuking the Gnosticism that is at the root of equity and the whole DEI thing, and that certain groups of people have special access to knowledge that others do not. And I have heard Christians say this kind of thing, and that is a direct contradiction of Scripture, of so many different things, but the basic thing is that we all have access to the Father through Jesus Christ. There's one mediator between man and God. There's no Greek or Jew. There's no slave or free. We're all one in Christ. Ephesians 2, he's torn down the wall of hostility. So that'd be a whole episode to talk about this. Galatians 3 talks about this. You really can't trumpet the fundamentals of the DEI movement and hold on to Ephesians 2, Galatians 3, and things like that. So I think that's actually the disconnect, why we don't hear that. But I wish that more conservative-minded Christians would recognize that it's not, as Dallas Jenkins says, that Jenneth quotes, he's not simply showing diversity to be more politically correct and just appeal to more people as possible and just run up the box office numbers or something like that, or get all the grants from Hollywood. Like, this isn't funded by Hollywood. This is funded by fans, and fans are rightly just recognizing, as Dallas does, that there are very different people in this world. And yet the appeal of the true gospel is that Jesus is for everyone and that everyone needs Christ because all are sinners and yet all can be forgiven.
Zach, somehow I've not heard any pundits, political, cultural, or otherwise, ask this question based on a trick of the language. What is the difference between equality and equity? It's all. You cut the all out of equality and you get equity.
Great insight.
Yeah. Very accidental here. This was not even in the show notes, but maybe it needs to be. Yeah, it's not like the Chosen writer set out to make a political story or make a statement about DEI or other buzzwords that may not even have aged very well. By the time you hear this episode, it's kind of going out the door from a lot of corporations, and hopefully including studios like Disney and all of those, kind of getting out of there as an imposter, back to equality and away from this buzzword equity. But they ended up implicitly rebuking that kind of thing simply by following a better tradition, a better view of humanity that is foregrounded in a biblical anthropology. And I will defend that, even if you might have some issues with the biblical fiction elements or the characterization of Jesus or his disciples in The Chosen. Coming in at position number 3, speaking of Christ's false and true, I enjoyed the fact that this one was actually in the top 3 or the top 2 podcast episodes. Really, this actually be the runner-up for the most popular podcast episode of 2024. What if a false Christ started a cult in your town? That was our coverage of The Visitation, a novel by Frank Peretti that may not have angels versus demons special effects in it as much as humans versus humans, with the spiritual warfare lurking in the wings. But this, I think, is actually the best Frank Peretti novel, even if most people are familiar with his 2 Darkness novels. What if the spirit of Antichrist came to your town? Burned out pastor Travis Jordan is on break from ministry after the death of his wife, but then his small city of Antioch faces great signs and wonders from a new prophet who claims to be a better Christ than the true Jesus Christ. Just in time for our next summer book quest, challenge your faith and seek the true Savior for the 25-year anniversary of Frank Peretti's supernatural thriller, The Visitation. That novel released in 1999, and as I recall, that was the first new Frank Peretti novel that I got my hands on, and it came at just the perfect time to help me understand that, yes, guys, churches have issues. They really have issues, especially if you're a faithful volunteer or trying to be a pastor. You're going to meet some of the weirdest, silliest, nasty personalities trying to do ministry. And that's one reason why Travis burns out. It's not just because the people are rough, but because life is rough. He faces these terrible circumstances, the death of his wife, and then, what do you know? A false Christ comes to his backyard and starts taking the town for Christ, really for himself, and somehow knows all about Travis's backstory and not only rubs it in his face, but wants to recruit him for what turns out to be this new religious movement. So great spiritual themes there. I'll wager a lot of those have helped affect me and actually helped me anticipate some of the stuff that a lot of people struggle with now. they get into church stuff, or they go to a new school, or get a new employer, or someplace like that, and then they discover, wow, some professing Christians are really terrible. Well, this book got there first and glorified the true Jesus Christ and honored the church and honored local churches despite all those terrible things, in a way that I would love to see more of from newer Christian storytellers. So all the props to Frank Peretti, who loves Jesus, who loves the church, who may not be writing anything anymore since his novel Illusion, which is also really good, but was used by God as a very formative influence in not just my fantastical fan life, but in my Christian life.
Okay, so Stephen, 7 months after we recorded this episode, I'm finally about to finish the book.
Where did you get stuck, brother?
Just starting too many other books. I am that distracted boyfriend meme that's like, oh, look, another book. So that's often my problem. I just start too many of them and forget to go back. But man, I've really been enjoying it lately, especially as we get to the backstory of the good and bad of Travis being a pastor in Antioch, Washington, this kind of mythical place, and recounting the good and the bad, but a lot of the really good. And it's kind of like reminding him, here's why you got into all this. And so I really have come to see this book as a love letter to pastors and missionaries who have faced burned out and yet kept going. It really resonates with me. I've been in vocational ministry now for over 20 years. I've definitely had some good and bad times, some ups and downs. But it's also a love letter to these types of vocational ministry folks who are also fans of the X-Files, because I can totally see the influence of something like the X-Files or the Twilight Zone or whatever. I don't know what Peretti was into, but it definitely feels like the X-Files at times. So it's not this big explosion type of supernatural thing, but it's sort of this very subtle threat. I mean, it's very fantastical, it's very supernatural, but I just absolutely love the unexplained mystery element that's going on through this whole story. And it's like, okay, I guess this is just normal now for this town to have these kind of weird things happening. And I don't know if we'll figure out why and what's all behind it. I mean, we kind of know, but I love the way that Peretti kind of interweaves both of these themes.
Exactly. The spiritual warfare is real, but if you're showing up to see Captain Tal versus J.R.R., the Prince of Babylon, you're going to have a bad time. Every scene is set on the human side of things, but the malevolent spiritual forces are still there. You just feel more of their effects. And so it's actually kind of a more developed, matured approach that is more like the horror monster being kept in the shadows. And so the impact is felt and is even more potent and is a little bit more realistic, because I think a lot of us have felt those dark spiritual influences in people's worldviews and in, people being nasty in the church or starting a cult in your town. And that's what Travis faces. I would wager, Zach, that if it were not for the visitation, there would not be Above the Circle of Earth. This is almost a comp title, but because this novel is not as well known as Peretti's novels, I don't want to say, I'm writing in the tradition of Frank Peretti, because there's a lot of people do that and they automatically are emphasizing the angels versus the demons, whereas I believe in angels versus demons, but I really prefer focusing on the human side of things. And so this novel to me has only grown for me whenever I read it. This past summer, before the book quest we did in the Lorehaven Guild, I actually listened for the first time to the audiobook narrated by Tom Taylorson, who did a fantastic job capturing all of the character voices and yet gave his own interpretation on this story, which is now 25 years old. And may the Lord grant it even more fans as we move forward into the next several decades. So my thanks to Frank Peretti, who we may never have on the show, but we're still going to give him all the shout outs that we can whenever it's necessary. Our top article at lorehaven.com was also an older article from Elijah David, released in 2022, but has obviously had some staying power and has appealed to many readers. It was part of his 7-part series, I'll Never Grow Too Old for Narnia. And this one was called Shasta's Meeting with Aslan in The Horse and His Boy Helped Me Embrace God's Sovereignty. I personally love this article, not just because I love The Horse and His Boy, but because it was so deeply personal for Eli and represents, I think, the journey of many readers who love The Horse and His Boy and who love stories that, just like The Visitation, help them not only follow along and enjoy a terrific yarn, but also made them into better Christians. Here's a clip from that article. It comes in at position number 2 of our top 10 I can remember the first time I read this scene and felt confusion about the truth that Aslan harmed someone. So the context there, breaking the quote, is that Aravis from the nation of Calormen, which is not Narnia, but which is one of Narnia's neighbors, has learned that Aslan himself wounded her, actually came after her and clawed at her back and caused her terrific injury. But resuming the quote, but I also felt certain that Aslan had been right to do so. And I knew the beauty and terror of how intimately Aslan had been involved in Shasta's life. Yes, as protector and comforter, but also as one source of pain and trouble. How could I reconcile these varied thoughts and emotions there, end quote. And Eli explains more of that in this article. Of course, we will have that link in the show notes. One of the top Narnian moments in the entire 7-book series is the moment when Aslan finally reveals himself to Shasta, and spoiler alert, very memorably says, I was the lion. Every lion you heard, every terrible creature stalking the forest, that was me. I was at the back of your story all along, these past several weeks and months. I was the lion who comforted you. I was the lion who chased you and forced you to meet Aravis in the forest. And I was the lion you don't remember from even earlier in your story. Lewis had some beliefs about God's sovereignty on paper that I would actually disagree with. But here you see Aslan behaving much like the God who told Isaiah, I believe it was Isaiah, that I, the Lord, bring calamity and tumult. I overthrow cities. I cast down rulers. I bring natural disasters. That was me all along, Barry, but not in a villainous way, in a good way. God says to the prophet, I, the Lord, do these things. And that's reflected, regardless of Lewis's on-paper beliefs about God's providence, that's reflected in what Aslan says about Shasta's story. That Aslan personally was there guiding it, all for the good of Shasta and Aravis and for his own name in the story. So it makes perfect sense to me that more readers were drawn to this. I saw it hitting the top articles running several weeks, not too long ago. We actually have now a top article section at the Lorehaven.com front page right now. And I was at first mystified, but then I was confused. I think in this year, especially with elections and cultural clashes and all of that stuff, I'm glad that readers were seeking out a story that reminded them that God is at the back of it. It was him all along, and we can trust him. We do rest between the paws of the true Aslan, whether or not they are velveted or whether or not the claws are out.
Yeah, this is a really hard aspect of God to come to terms with, especially if you've been touched by things like cancer or other tragedies or drunk driver accidents or just random evil. It's very difficult to put all that in the context of God's sovereignty, and yet there's kind of a simple answer to that, which is that we live in the universe God created, a universe which includes, all of these kind of tragedies and evils. And so there is a very basic sense in which God is sovereign over all this, because he created the starting conditions of the universe that allowed all those kinds of things to happen. And so you can't really escape his sovereignty, even if you don't want to think that he's sovereign in each and every one of those things. It's like he's ultimately sovereign over all of those horrible things that happen in our life. And yet we also know that he is sovereign about the way that history will end, and then in the new heavens and new earth that are coming, and that he will wipe away every tear. It's really hard to reconcile all that in just a couple of minutes, even in a whole podcast episode. But something that I've been telling my kids lately is to remember that Jesus was a man of sorrows, that he wept when others wept. And he personally experienced pain and rejection and evil and injury. And he had no place to lay his head. Like, he was sleepless, homeless, tired. So he went through many and many, many of the same things and horrible experiences that we have gone through. And so he's inhabited those experiences, and we can turn to him when we are facing those as well. And he is our comforter in the midst of that. And he's really going for the gold here with this article, and really pressing in to what it means for, Aslan to be the lion, like I was the lion, and how that reflects this aspect of God. But it's really the only place we can find comfort, because otherwise, as my pastor said, otherwise we live in a world that is run by drunk drivers, or we live in a universe that is directed by cancer, or we live in a world that is under the absolute control of sin. And that's actually a much more horrible place to live. Or even just we live in a universe that's completely undirected by random chance, and there is no purpose or meaning to anything. It's all just pointless. That's also not a comforting story to tell yourself. And so sometimes the truly comforting stories, there are some hard things that you have to accept.
Zach, you just convicted me with that, and Eli convicts me, and Aslan convicts me, and Lewis convicts me. A choir of four now shouting at me to trust in God's sovereignty, because on Friday, the 13th of December, I learned that I might have to shell out thousands of dollars for a vehicle repair. Now, that might not be the case. As we record, I don't quite know the ending to that story, but I should know that Aslan, really Jesus Christ, whom Aslan represents, is at the back of that, and I need to trust him, even with all of that nonsense going on, which of course happens at Christmas. So many things break at Christmas, including Christmas trees. I still got to try to fix that, so we'll see if that happens, but either way, God is good, and I can rest in his sovereignty. So now that I've said it on a podcast, I better prove it in my life. Anyway, let's re-roll that Fantastical Truth theme music, even in our heads, because the top podcast episode of Fantastical Truth for the year 2024 is coming in at position number 1. Should stories minimize morality to advance personal liberation? With Thomas Umstattd Jr. This was a fascinating episode because we threw it together after a Thomas article at stevelobby.com in January 2024 went fairly viral in our community, proving fairly controversial among folks, but we almost entirely took Thomas's side on this, and we were able to get him on the podcast in short notice back in January of this year. Here's the summary. Once upon a time, more literary heroes pursued virtue, or at least knew that they should. But in more modern stories, main characters aren't motivated by being good, but by being right. They exchange the truth and law of God for the lie of personal liberation. In a world of abuse and tyrants, this can feel appealing. Yet how does this exchange ultimately make stories worse? So Zach, we've already talked about this some, about the Disney stuff and even The Chosen succeeding where woke stories fail. It really is not so much about the label woke, which can mean different things to many people, but this notion of personal liberation. I'm going to be set free from the restraints of the old morality, the old traditions, the stuff that keeps me down, and now I'm going to rise up and I'm going to be more powerful than they are. And in so doing, by winning, I am right. Virtue, morality, just ignore all that stuff. And Thomas's point here in this article is not only is this wrong, but it doesn't work. Thomas is the novel marketing podcast guy. He also runs the Christian publishing show and now the novel marketing conference that's coming up in our area this month in January. So Thomas is all about making things work for authors. So he's very practical there and has a lot of experience. But he also wants to correct false beliefs with true ones. This article and this episode does both at the same time. But really the takeaway here is that as we close 2024 and go into 2025, irrespective of whether or not this personal liberation stuff is true, it doesn't work. It's not profitable. There may be some conspirators who are funding this stuff or giving grants for people to promote this propaganda in their video games or their TV shows or their movies. But once the funding and once the trend runs out, the money's gone. This stuff is not profitable. You go this away, you go broke. Entire video game studios are being torn asunder by this, and corporations are retooling after losing multiple millions of dollars on these kinds of stories because the fans do not want them. The fans who love these stories do not want personal liberation propaganda. They want what they believe is classical morality. They want heroes' journeys or heroines' journeys that emphasize the flaws of the hero or heroine and then fight to be better in pursuit of their goal and the defeat of a real villain. They don't just want the stories where hero or heroine learns that he or she, more likely she, had the power all along and just needs to get in touch with that inner strength, rather than, failing and then kind of experiencing a kind of death before the new life comes in. And then suddenly all hopelessness turns to the fulfillment of hope and the eucatastrophe. I can get really worked up about this one, but the fact is I don't have to argue about it. The results speak for themselves. These folks are getting fired who are pushing this propaganda, whether or not they wanted to. these stories are failing. And there may be risks in going back to the old kinds of stories that emphasize classical morality, because as Christians, we don't just believe in morals, we believe in Jesus Christ. But it's much better to have stories that reflect the law of God rather than the fake law of man. The law of God is necessary to help lead people to that Savior. The law of man is going to be a fake Savior, and we don't want fake Saviors in our stories. We want stories that are going to lead people one way or another back to the true Savior.
You know, the Babylon Bee just had a great article about this of 9 warning signs an upcoming movie might be woke. And it's things like the director promised a fresh take for a modern audience.
Boo, hiss.
Yeah,
No.
you know, you've been told you're an evil person if you don't like it. And there's 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes. You know, there's so many more in this article. It's hilarious. But we've all kind of wised up to this, how the movies that, the remakes or the classic tales that are being visualized, or, these sequels or prequels, we've all kind of gotten wise to how these are being subverted and used to push an agenda. And we're not going to get fooled anymore by this stuff. Like we've all kind of figured this out. And you're right, it's not profitable anymore. A lot of Hollywood studios, game studios, they don't know what to do. The streaming giants, they're like, well, this isn't working. What do we give people? Well, I guess we'll just make a live action adaptation of a cartoon they already like. You know, it's like they're just kind of recycling old ideas because they can't figure out better ideas. And this is a great opportunity for Christian creators to say, hey, we have a framework for great stories. You know, we have the classic virtues like Thomas talks about. We were the ones that first came up with this, like Paul Bunyan's, classic tale, The Pilgrim's
John
Progress.
Bunyan,
Sorry,
Paul Bunyan
I
had
always
the
get
big
that
blue
mixed up.
ox. Yeah, I know,
Thank
right?
you.
All the Bunyans.
Another fantastical tale, but yeah,
Yes, really is.
But we have the framework and the Christian worldview for the kinds of stories that resonate with people, the kinds of stories based on like the hero's journey, which not necessarily like a Christian framework, but very, very much informed by a Christian worldview, that there is a moral universe. It's not just identity directed, power grabbing, or sort of a Gnostic view of dismantling everything. That's what leads to a better world, or there's no truth but power. No one really believes in this kind of stuff. It's all a very cynical way of looking at the world. And I'm just so glad we're moving past this age of cynicism and into more earnest and sincere types of stories. I think it's why we're seeing the rise of Korean dramas on Netflix. I mean, those are huge. It's why we're seeing, as Thomas points out, in the the anime section of bookstores, the Japanese written stories are way outperforming the Western graphic novels, because again, they're coming at it from that more virtuous point of view, or the point of view that virtue matters, I guess you could say, in rejecting some of this postmodernism view of things. So the best days are ahead of us. We're gonna see more of these good stories, but it might not come from the studios that have always put these out. It might come from some surprising places.
And some of those surprising places include Christian creatives who are making these fantastical stories, often publishing them themselves, but also there are so many great companies, publishers, organizations that are doing this. Some of them sponsor this show. Some of them haven't yet sponsored the show, but let this be your New Year's resolution, faithful listener. Find those stories, follow those folks, find those authors, follow them on social media, as well as following this podcast and Lorehaven.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or X. Look for the name Lorehaven there, or email us podcast@lorehaven.com and tell us, what was your favorite Lorehaven podcast episode, article, or review? Anything else that we do at that site. Then more importantly than telling us, as I've mentioned, tell a friend, tell a family member. We exist to serve Christian fans who are looking for these kinds of things and may not even know that they exist. That's startling to me in my Christian fantastical world, that there's a whole wider world out there of fans and potential fans who just need to know where to find this stuff. Share your favorite story or your favorite Lorehaven article or podcast with that person and help get them started on this journey as we move forward into the year 2025. And I wish to wish you happy new year, as happy as you can make it in light of God's sovereignty and in light of this rightful backlash against propagandistic stories in favor of more classically moral stories. Lord willing, we will return next week for a look back at a website that is part of Lorehaven's ancestry. Its legacy predates Lorehaven because way back in 2006, several other Christian fantasy creators, I wasn't even involved with them yet, they started a team blog called Speculative Faith. So I thought, starting a new year, let's look back on this project that led to thousands, I think, of great articles from dozens of creators, might be hundreds actually. I'll need to come up with some numbers, and then later grew Speculative Faith into the Lorehaven mission and this very podcast. I hope you'll have an amazing new year. We're just taking a week between these episodes. We already had our Christmas break, but thank you so much for following this podcast, for subscribing to Lorehaven if you have. We're looking forward to many more amazing episodes going into January and February as we're surveying genres that we haven't really talked about and looking back on the Lorehaven mission and letting you know what's next for us. Join the mission. Subscribe to Lorehaven, tell a friend, but more importantly, enjoy these fantastical stories for God's glory as we continue to seek and find His fantastical truth.